sensibility of and the size of the challenge that lies ahead of us. I think 2022 has concluded with ongoing wars in parts of the world, fuel price shocks, millions slipping back into poverty, the lack of adequate finance flows, so on and so forth. And I think as we enter into 2023, we're faced with, of course, the backlog of all of that, but also the recognition that we're entering into recession. Globally, there is going to be trade growth is going to slow down to only 1% this year. We know that the climate crisis looms very large over all of us. In India alone, 80% of our population lives in districts that's prone to climatic disasters, and they live with extreme risk sort of hanging over their heads. So the size of the problems is extremely large, and the reason that we're having this discussion today is because a lot of these are in fact global common challenges which have very local repercussions as well. And the multilateralism setup that we have created, or that got created on the back of the Second World War largely, is largely ineffective in responding to these, and in some cases, it's plain to say that multilateralism has completely failed. And so I'm really pleased to be in a position of being able to ask the questions and how we sort of tackle this rather than being able to answer them. But I do want to sort of set the stage a little bit in recognizing the sort of reform. But before that, if reform really is the way to go, right, where we're entering a world of multipolarity, can these individual, multilateral entities actually bring about the change and can be reformed to be able to solve for some of these problems, or do we need to be thinking as the G20 or the T20 that feeds into the diplomacy of the G20 to be superseding these organizations with some sort of global governance principles that, as Ambassador mentioned, talk about accountability, talk about transparency, talk about equity. Can that system bring about the kind of financing flows that, as the G20 has recognized previously, addresses risk, because that's really the big problem, that addresses public finance being used to bring about private sector mobilization participation in the sectors that need it the most. I mean, I think it was only last week that the president of the World Bank also mentioned, right, that MDBs and IFIs globally have been able to mobilize only 0.2% of private sector finance of the global GDP. So the sort of progress that we're seeing is really not keeping pace with the responsiveness that we need. And so with that, I'd actually like to perhaps turn to Nicholas, and we just take it down the stage in that order, to talk to all of us a little bit about where the G20 fits into this, how do we start thinking about these reforms, and, and what your thoughts are really on the size and the scale of the challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, Shika, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Humbly, we have been part of the T20 in the past 6 years, right? So sharing also the crossing the lines with other engagement groups, think tanks, and the G20. I would just like to start by maybe saying, and I see our colleagues from Indonesia here, that one of the most difficult and challenging exercise maybe to start with is to ensure that the great ideas that are put on the table of the T20, they are effectively shared with leaders and with governments. And the way the agenda are set up, etc., show that it's not easy. Right? That is the first point. We heard the addresses of Sherpa Amitabh Kant, of President Chinoy, of Samir Serhan. I can only very much support that. But if we want to be effective, and we have great ideas and great inputs, probably we need to find ways through the T20 both to strengthen links with other groups. I'm thinking, for example, what was initiated during the G20 Italy in terms of reforming, transforming infrastructure, investment and finance. Instead of saying we need to transform a system, the decision was, let's go to others, right? See, T20, B20, D20 long-term investor club, a joint statement declaration and joint work. That was continued and carried out during the G20 Indonesia. That proves to be quite a good recipe. But of course, it's very incremental. It's not addressing the reform of the multilateral system as you have raised it. The second point is already also about finding allies, finding support, right? Last year, the G7 Germany introduced a T7, right? And this year, Dean Sonobe is chairing that T7 as part of the G7 Japan. How can we avoid that we reinvent the club in the G7? That would be the T7, and that would how to make sure that it can go hand in hand with the T20 and find some leverage to address a number of key questions. Right? That's another aspect. The last comment I would like to make as we are starting our discussion, of course. When you look at a number of factors, this was mentioned this morning, for instance, SDG finance, how to complete the Agenda 2030. Sometimes a number of institutions are always saying, oh, we have gaps, right? And trillion gaps or dozens of trillion gaps. It means nothing. How can anyone fix dozens of trillion gaps? It just means one system is fading and we need to reassess it. But how to do it, right? And the tasks seems a little bit beyond the reach of any particular organization. However, I would like to share a message of optimism. For instance, last year, nobody was certain there would even be a declaration of the G20, and overnight, during the G20 summit itself, right, a missile came from the Ukraine territory, landed in Poland, killed some villagers, and there was a diplomatic crisis. Out of that diplomatic crisis, and because the leaders were around the same table, right, they worked overnight, and it didn't become the start of a world war, really, right? And there was a declaration, and the declaration was endorsed by all countries, right? And similarly, a few days afterwards, at the APEC summit in Bangkok, there was another ballistic missile which was launched from North Korea, another, etc. So what I'm thinking here is that the G20, of course, we have a lot of working groups, etc., but the G20 is also a very, very active place for diplomacy, put it simply, and not just one leader's summit. But whenever you discuss with counterparts or friends or colleagues or in general public, they are absolutely not aware that a G20 cycle is dozens, if not hundreds of meetings. So probably there is also a little bit of information to the general public that is not just a leaders' summit where you compare the outfit of the spouses, etc., but something that goes much deeper so that there would be also some overall support to that kind of framework. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this excellent Inception conference and for having me here today. I'm Stormy Miltner, and I've been involved in the T20 and T7 over the last couple of years because I was with the B20, B7 before that. And I was the German Sherpa for the B20 when Germany had the presidency. So I really know how much effort there is in organizing the whole process in such an Inception conference. And I really want to laud the organizer for putting this together and for ensuring such an early start and getting the task forces working and for also getting to know each other, because this is one of the really important parts of the G20 process, but also of the engagement processes, to create understanding, to create trust as a basis for developing new ideas, which then should be formulated into actionable policy recommendations. And I think we the organizers have ensured an excellent kickoff and start, so thank you very, very much. I want to underline what you have just said with regard to the importance of the G20. International cooperation has become so much more difficult over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, and a lot of trust and understanding has been lost. And the G20 is one of the fora which serves as a very, very important forum to ensure cooperation in a world in which we see more and more geopolitical frictions, more and more fragmentation, more and more conflict, and less understanding and trust. And yes, there are many criticisms towards the G20 and the process, which are absolutely justified, but it is one of the most important fora we have to make progress, and we have to work on making the process more legitimate and also more effective. And the engagement groups are one very, very important part of it, not just the T20, but also the B20, the C20, the W20, also the Cities 20, and all the others. And what is really important, and I also want to underline what you just said, is that we need to get out of our silos and get the engagement groups together, as has been done on several occasions, on the big global pressing issues and concerns which have been outlined earlier in this inception meeting. Because we as a global community are facing a multiple crisis, really. We heard about the climate crisis, we heard about the food security crisis, the energy crisis, the really standard of living or living cost crisis, and all in a changing geopolitical environment, and the health crisis. And all of these issues can't be solved in a singular approach, but they need to be addressed across the issue lines, because climate has a lot to do with health. Health has a lot to do with the living the prices of living cost crisis, and so on. So we need to get more out of our silos, and we need to get the stakeholders together. And that's why I really found it very encouraging to hear several times that already the engagement groups are cross-working on these issues together, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So when it comes to multilateralism, I do share the point that we need to reform multilateralism, and that in parts it hasn't served us, but multilateralism is really important, and the organizations we have are as well. So what I would always underline, it's not so much the organizations itself which haven't served us, because many of them are member-driven organizations. It's the members, it's ourselves who haven't served ourselves. So we need to be honest with ourselves and not point at, for example, one of the issue areas where I work on, trade and the WTO. It's not so much the WTO which has failed us, it's the members which have failed us. And the G20 are important members in this organization, so we have to work with the G20 to ensure that reforms can be implemented in those organizations. But without the political will, there's also no way. So we need to ensure the political way. And I hope that through reforms we will look at two big issues, which is input legitimacy as well as the effectiveness of these organizations. And with regard to input legitimacy, I would say we need to look at the transparency of the decision-making process, the timeliness of the decision-making process, the accessibility to the negotiations, and the representativeness. And with regard to the effectiveness, we need to measure and look at the output. Is actually any kind of output produced, but then go one step further. Is the output actually changing a problem? Yes or no, and how far? And then also at the impact, do they fulfill the mandate that they have? And if we are honest with us, there are lots of problems on all those different criteria I just mentioned, and we have to work through them. And they have an effect on each other. So input legitimacy has a huge effect on the effectiveness, but also the other way around. And I hope that we come back in the discussion on the WTO and on trade issues, because I've already spoken too long. But we already discussed in the Task Force 7 some of the ideas which could be put forward. What is really important is that we don't repeat ourselves, because we have been talking about reforms for a really long time. And now we need to also move from having the ideas to trying to overcome the implementation hurdles. So I hope that we will also talk about those and not just the ideas, but how to implement them. And so overall, thank you so much for this wonderful Inception conference.
Great, thank you, Stormy. Epsista, I could move to you next, please.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me, and I would like to congratulate India for having G20. India is a friend of my country, and also one of the great powers when we are talking about multipolar. I think should include India as one of those great powers who achieved a lot and should be recognized. It's argued that multilateral institutions were not built on multiplexity. While that may be true, but we cannot ignore that they have existed for over 71 years and provided whatever system that exists today. It would be better to use the structure in place to find better alternative. Dismantling an existing system, whatever the reason, may not be reasonable. Now, the Westro new liberal order, standing for free market, free speech, and free trade, is no longer written in the stone. The Russian-Ukraine conflict has dented much of its soft power, and they are finding it much more challenging to convince the world about the primacy of this order. An alternative has to emerge in the East to counter this narrative. The question is, are we there yet? Are the Eastern there yet? I think India has to answer this in the G20. Now, also, we cannot reform multilateral institution without applying a bit of realism. In fact, more realism may be lead to more realism might lead to more multilateralism. Realism should also be the ingoing force while dealing with decisive issues. Unequal wealth distribution and regional conflicts. In certain way, bilateral might be the way forward to reach multilateral objectives. Hence, we must make these objectives converge to achieve multiple goals. Now, finding multilateral global security order most challenging. With multilaterals and with militaries and welfare becoming asymmetrical and cyber warfare becoming the order of the day, cooperation and coordination across multilateral institutions go beyond just reforming them. With these reformed institutions, see eye to eye on some critical security issue? How do we develop a multilateral consensus in the fight against climate change? it would be better to use the structure to place, to find a better alternative. Reform multilateral institutions could have the right solutions for this crisis. If that's the case, we must start developing that consensus, because climate change is humanity's biggest existential crisis now we are facing. Multilateral financial or finance also needs at least some level of confidence building. Should I start?
If you could start
Okay.
reading.
Just this is the last one. Once again, we need the best of both worlds in this domain. The motivation should be to complement and not compete. The world of finance has evolved, but has also become very complex. It is time to simplify them and ensure their trickle down effect benefit the needy, not just those with complex financial instruments. The world need to be, if we are talking about multilateralism, especially with we are now under going back to leaving multipolar world to bipolar world, especially between US and China. I think the other world should work for their national interests. We are talking about Asia vis-a-vis the West. We should look eye to eye, and our interests should become first and above all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to thank the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, and T20 India core group led by Ambassador Chinoy and my good friend Samir Sarang and Sachin and other leaders and task force chairs, co-chairs, and all participants. Good morning, and thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here as part of this excellent panel. I'm Dean and CEO of Asian Development Bank Institute. This is a subsidiary of ADB, so it is itself a multilateral organization. So I'm a believer of multilateralism. So for me, it's very simple. So the worldwide, the leaders and the policymakers are tackling with global and regional problems, as well as their domestic problems. And it's clear that global and regional problems must be solved globally and regionally, and also peacefully. So for me, it's so obvious that multilateralism is crucial, very important. And then there have been a lot of experiments of efficient and effective multilateralism. And then G20 is very important because it was created because there are problems that G7 couldn't solve. So G20 is very important, but of course, again, many people find inefficiency, ineffectiveness, and then there are some disappointments. So it must be improved. Then just G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant pointed out, intellectual input is very important. It should play a key role. Then how to get good intellectual input? So yeah, even among in this panel, there are experts who have great idea and about the reform, including Annika, Astomi Annika. So, but there may be other good proposals and insights and ideas. How to get it? So here the think tanks have to play a very important role with their strong convening power, convening world-class experts and big audience. And from them, we may be able to find very good ideas. And the good ideas must be improved so as to be able to be input for policy making. So for that purpose, we have to examine the good ideas from different angles. So multidisciplinary approach and very scientific data-based analysis, and also historical insight. So those things must be mixed, and then we will examine good ideas to make good ideas, great ideas. And then we have to make great idea scale up. So this is what think tanks have to do, and the only think tanks can do. Of course, there are a variety of think tanks. Some are extremely domestic. Some are just for giving advice to the individual investors. But there are international, multilateralism kind of supporters, and who are thinking of the global issues. And those people are gathering here. And if not here, but they are working on the T20 brief, policy brief abstract right now to meet the deadline. So as for T7, we closed the submission of abstract, and then we received well more than 200 abstracts. And then I'd like to congratulate T20 India, which has already get almost 800. So we have many, many supporters. So then I think that think tanks in the world will play the key role in supporting, improving, strengthening multilateralism. Okay, thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to express my gratefulness to organizers of T20, and especially to my friends Ambassador Chinoy and Dr. Saran, who have invited me to be here and to take part in this outstanding session. I'm working for the think tank which is supporting ideas of polycentricity and multilateralism and global governance in my country for the last 30 years, or even more. And what we see now in the situation with development of international institutions, their effectiveness and their activities, the structure, the logic of their functioning is very complicated, because not only because of divergency among major powers, but also because it includes very different elements developed in different periods of development of international system. Some of international institutions, especially global and responsible for peace and security, like United Nations, but not only this, also some others, they have developed during the Cold War period, and they have some elements and influence of that system. Some of institutions which are consisting right now the international institution environment have developed during the Cold War, but inside the Western community, and have expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the end of the Cold War, like WTO, like World Bank, like IMF, and others. And some institutions which are progressively developing, and to my mind, expressing the new trends in development of international system, towards its more polycentric and more complicated in terms of major economic and political players, and which I can describe as soft global governance institutions of polycentric world order like G20, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are rapidly getting more and more influence, but influence is not power, it's something else. And what we can see right now is a cycle of decline of influence of international institutions in general, but at the same time we see that institutional framework is getting more, and institutional environment is getting more and more consolidated. And it means that on the next level of cycle of development of international institutions, many of them in a transformed form, maybe in some new forms, can get more and more power and more effectiveness. What we see now is a very specific tendency when international institutions focused on special spheres of activity, very specific niches on which they are working on, are sometimes becoming more and more effective, but global institutions sometimes, unfortunately, are prolapsing. And this prolapse is a huge challenge towards everyone who are responsible for their development, including major powers. And the paradox of current situation with United Nations and with other international institutions on European level or OSCE is in fact that they're not too small or not sufficient in terms of their forms and practices, but they are underused in the practices, regimes they are really having in their legal, political and institutional backgrounds. I absolutely agree with the position that the UN Security Council should be expanded with the new permanent Security Council members who will also receive the right of veto, and of course India and Brazil, and of course one of countries of Africa should be among those who have to be invited into the UN Security Council as permanent members with veto right. But will this expansion immediately give more power to the UN Security Council and make UN institutions more effective? I don't have an answer on this question, and nobody has. And I agree with Dr. Milner that she said that the role of major powers, the role of countries who are driving international institutions in this sense are critical. We see that sometimes the expansion, like it happened with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is not bringing effectiveness because right now India and China are trying to block each other's initiatives each time one of them is bringing initiative to the table, and it's a challenge for all other Shanghai Cooperation Organization members. Concerning G20 and concerning the development of this organization, we see very positive trend that G20, which has emerged as an institution focused on financial economic issues, is, and I'm finalizing, is getting deeper and deeper into social, humanitarian, and environmental issues. And I think it's a good trend because everybody understanding the economic development is impossible without all these very significant factors and aspects. But what I see as one of critical issues for development of G20 is more and more focus on education and science. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think there's been a plethora of different sort of opinions and actually suggestions as well, right? Starting from what is it that we as researchers can do, you know, in trying to influence the process, how the G20 has been responsive, particularly in terms of the financial crises that the world has seen, you know, how it's trying to influence massive cross-cutting issues, right, which are governed by entities solely looking at particulars, but not the overlaps. And I think that's a lot of area for us to delve a bit deeper into. Nicholas, you started in saying that G20 is a responsive platform, right? And I'm wondering if I can perhaps start with you as we go back down this line again, given the time that we're at, is amidst all of the richness and all of the potential and all of the challenges, what should India's presidency be bringing to the table to ensure a successful outcome in terms of a responsive multilateralism, in your opinion, right? So what would you consider to be a success, and what should the presidency really be thinking about or harping on amidst this, the options that lie ahead of us?
Does it work? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. In a nutshell, I would say two things. First, it's incredible how we are losing memory from one cycle of G20 to the other. So I think Dean Sonobe insisted on the role of think tanks so that there can be some continuity. And I think this is very, 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 very important. That's the first point. Second point, about our discussion now, reform of multilateralism, G20, etc. If we were to ask people in the room or online, because a number of colleagues are following us online, about the Seoul Development Consensus, right, which was an anchor in the G20 in 2010 after the resolution of the heat of the financial crisis, I'm not sure what would be the level of answering. But then there was the Seoul Development Consensus in 2010, which really framed a number of ways which we are still dealing with, right? Second, 2015, 2016, G20 Turkey and China with the SDGs and the framework of the Agenda 2030. So where we are now, I think we would need a new cycle, right? A new step in these cycles. And the last point I would like to make, because time is very short, in fact, two things. First of all, in the T20, and there are a number of people in the room here who have experienced the T20 since the beginning, or the consolidation. It's also very difficult to consolidate the results and to have an acquis that can be shared. And it should not become a closed club. It should constantly be opened. So we will be publishing soon a book with the Asian Development Bank Institute about the last decade of the T20 and what it's brought and how this might contribute to consolidate multilateralism. But on the other hand, one way also that is a bit underestimated at government level to cope with multilateralism is to work on the instruments of how the world system is working, right? Infrastructure systems, cities, urbanizations have constantly deemed as very technical aspects, but without a global approach to such issues, we will take the risk of having discussions about governance features that doesn't address and tackle the physical and concrete conditions of how the world system works or not. So these would be my comments.
Great, thank you. If I can move to Stormy and to Epstisam together, actually, because you brought in a really interesting point that it's not that these entities or institutions are failing, it's the membership or the shareholders that are, failing to respond. And you brought in a really interesting point that we need to start thinking about them as complementary and not necessarily competing organizations. So keeping those 2 points of view in mind, what is your sort of hope and what are you going to be trying to push within the T20 towards the G20 to arrive at success later this year?
Yeah, thank you so much. There are already so many ideas on the table. Maybe 2-3 points. First of all, I think the issue of continuity is really important, but also bringing, but also not completely sticking to what has been done in the past, obviously. I mean, you always need to bring in new ideas, this G20 presidency is a really important opportunity because it's the first time that in the Troika, it's all three emerging economies who are representing the process. And that is a huge opportunity to bring in new ideas. So I think that the Troika plays a really important role and might even be a little bit more outgoing, transparent, and informative in what it is doing. I know that it plays a hugely important role behind the scenes, but maybe it also makes sense to report a little bit more on what's going on in the Troika discussions. The second thing what I would say is that is really on the point of not competing but being complementary. Maybe it's time to bring in a few more regional institutions, regional corporations in a more structured way and in an organized way into the G20. We all know that the EU has been represented as a full member of the G20 for quite a while, so maybe it's now time to also bring in other regional organizations and to make that more structured than in the past, not just as a guest, an observer, but really as a part of the process. The third one is with regard to consensus. I think it's hugely important to stick to the consensus principle on the G20 and not to introduce a several-speed G20, because this is one of the institutions where we actually still see cooperation. And for this, I think that the joint declarations are really important. So we need to try to have consensual, not just chair declarations in the G20, but declarations which are signed by all members. And for this, I have to also laud the Indonesia G20 that it succeeded in having one joint declaration in the end, because over a few weeks, it looked like that would not be possible on a lot of issues, on geopolitical issues, on Russia's war on Ukraine, but also on climate issues. And some of the ministerial meetings in part were chair statements more than consensual member statements, and we need to have those member statements. So that is really important. The fourth point, I would say that while we have this consensus principle, we also need to try out other forms of cooperation and negotiations within the G20. And what about ways to increase trust and understanding by, for example, doing crisis scenario exercises and scenario building exercises in the G20. The German G20 presidency tried that with regard to health and crisis management. And I think that would be an exercise on natural disasters, for example, on health disasters, where this exercise could lead us also to a little bit more trust and understanding. Okay. And last point, implementation.
All right, maybe we'll come back to that because I need to give space for other speakers as well.
Ideas.
No problem.
You have to stop me. Yes.
I agree with what all she said. Bringing regional organization, this is very important, and how to cooperate on two levels. But it must be something special for India to bring here. Okay, I think we heard the India's experience, the successful experience in terms of fighting climate change and technological revolution, where this should be shown to the world as becoming from considered as developed country for now to can be a great power. This is how this path has been achieved. Indian experience should be shown in this now. Regarding the dispute or differences in Indonesia G20, maybe, you know, in the beginning, you work on what can bring these countries together and leave their differences aside and try to work on that differences before, and you have to know it. Of course, it's obvious before they are coming to the summit, but what is the main issues. They can agree on it. And I have also something to say about the climate change here. I agree. Just 2 days before I come here, I was sitting beside an European ambassador talking about the Europe energy security, and issue of that Europe, because of the climate change, did not need more energy this year, so it helped Europe. So how things can work different in different countries. These differences, how can you bring it and show that you cannot take it just this is negative in total? It might be a negative side and opposite positive side on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just as Mr. Kant mentioned earlier today, right, that if there's a challenge, there's usually an opportunity to try and solve it. And San, you mentioned, you know, the role of think tanks, and I'm wondering, you know, given the experiences that we've had, given the continuity that the T20 process is bringing, what are your sort of hopes for this year, you know, and how do you expect the T20 to try and solve for multilateralism to be brought back to be effective?
Yeah. Actually, my thoughts converged one point. So how to provide intellectual support for G20 in particular, and multilateralism in general. And then, as I said, what is important is to cast a big net as widely as possible across the world to catch many good ideas and then improve them, and then bridge those research and knowledge and policy making. Right? And then for that purpose, we have to have very big net, and then in other words, very strong convening power. And then the creation of T20 about 10 years, 11 years ago, you know, strengthened the think tanks convening power. And then the creation of T7 last year in Germany even strengthened our convening power in the world. And then I think if T7 and the T20 work together, then we can bridge G7 and the G20 better. So not just bridging research and policy making, but also bridging G7 and G20 better. That will contribute to improving, strengthening multilateralism.
Great, thank you.
I'll stop here.
And then to you, because you, I think you had started talking about the systemic change and, you know, how it is sort of getting reformed, and we'll see that wave come in. But for you, what would a successful G20 this year look like vis-a-vis bringing multilateralism back to being able to be effective?
Oh, there are several factors. Yeah, it's $1 million question, Shika. But there are several factors which are blocking the development of multilateralism, global governance, and effectiveness of international institutions. We have to do the checking, the sort of, system analysis of different obstacles, negative factors, crises, and challenges the international system of international institutions is facing. And I think in this sense, interaction of think tankers is critical. And what we are doing under T20 auspices is very significant. Last year, one of global big supporters of the power of think tanks and influence of interaction among think tanks, Jim McGann, has passed away, unfortunately, my very good friend. And since that time, the Global Think Tank Index, which was very significant product, has stopped. And I think that lots of activities which Jim has started should be prolonged and supported also maybe under the auspices of G20 and T20. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I know that time's up, but we're going to take 2 questions from the audience. Please make sure they're questions, not statements. You're going to have access to all of them over lunch. So also bear in mind that that's all that's standing between everybody and lunch is your question. So if there is anybody, there's mics around here. Is there anyone who has a question? Yes. Sir, please introduce yourself and keep the question short.
Yeah, I'm Anbu from IRIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, based in Jakarta. The objective of the multilateralism, or the expected outcome of multilateralism, is shared prosperity, peace, and shared growth. The G20 works when there is a crisis. It happened in 2008, and in 2017, that is the financial crisis, then migration crisis, and the last year it is a pandemic. It worked very well. So if this shared prosperity of multilateralism works beyond the crisis, what could be the agenda for the G20 India? Thank you.
Is there someone in particular you would like to? Okay. Is there someone who would like to take that in particular?
We would need another
Nicola,
hour.
it is.
No, it's a really huge question, and I might not have the answer, but clearly one way, and I think this was well expressed by this discussion, but also by the insights provided, including from Task Force 7, we need to pay a lot of attention about intersections between different sets of issues. And I think here we have several tasks, we have many task forces, we have very different backgrounds, there is this spirit of consensus, right? If we insist a little bit on aspects of continuity and consolidation on the one hand, plus work on those articulations, and be a bit more specific, including for ourselves, about how to bring concrete policy reforms and concrete policy proposals on the table, that will be a start to answer the questions of our colleague from area.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Yes, sir, just over there.
Thank you. My name is B. Shadrach from Commonwealth of Learning. This morning, Mr. Kant mentioned about one of the issues that is still left with is 4 billion people not having a digital identity. And
I'm sorry, could you speak up, please?
4 billion people not having the digital identity is something that Mr. Amitabh Kant underscored. And he also mentioned that digital transformation is key for learning outcomes. And I'm glad that our Russian colleague here also mentioned about learning outcomes. What could regional institutions do, given that 85% of the world is within G20, in order for us to address this 50% not having digital identity, thus not having the opportunity to enhance their learning opportunities?
Great, thank you. Feodor?
Very significant question, because, you know, it should be focused, such activities should be focused on very different but issues. Each of them is very important for this development. For example, fighting illiteracy, developing educational ties and educational exchanges without any political blocks and borders, promoting interaction among scientists and among think tankers, trying to bring positive agenda into the international relations and international institutional frameworks. And we need to stop any negative practices of blocking and breaking ties between scientists, think tankers, and educational communities. And that's critical.
Great, thank you. I think it would be very hard for me to conclude, actually, just the richness of the points that have been brought up throughout this morning. But my key takeaways are along 3 lines, right? One is very simply that we're all looking for greater inclusivity, right? So whether that is inclusiveness in the governance structures of the MDBs and IFIs that we're talking about, or inclusivity in the breadth of the think tanks that we're able to reach out to, or even inclusivity in who constitutes the G20 in the way that it is, right? And I think the second main thing that I'm taking away from this is recognizing and identifying the intersectionalities that different challenges are actually putting on the table. And I think if we're able to do both of those things and table those in an effective enough manner as the T20, we'd be off to a pretty good start in trying to bring multilateralism back to being effective. With that, I'd request you all to please give my panel a huge round of applause. And thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Just a few house